This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. If you've been a part of the innovation conversation in the humanitarian aid and international development sector for any amount of time, you have, more than once, admitted to yourself two things. First, innovation is only second to strategy as the most overused and abused word in the development or aid lexicon. And two, when people are talking about innovation, they're usually talking about technology. While I am as guilty as the next person, I admit that, I try my best to avoid stumbling into the trap of either of these pitfalls. However, when we mentally get past these two speed bumps, oftentimes we find that what we're really talking about is how do we get more or better data in a cost-effective way. Technology is helping to answer that question in a big way, and increasingly, I find myself having conversations with individuals and organizations that have access to some fairly large data sets. But then we quickly run into the next speed bump, which is unfortunately much bigger than the first two. How do we use this data to actually get better results from programming? Luckily, people like Dustin Homer of Development Gateway have the privilege of thinking about this issue every day. As my guest here on the Terms of Reference podcast for our 106th episode, Dustin and I discuss Development Gateway's Results Data Initiative, which explores how development results data can be collected, shared, and used more effectively. Dustin has learned, thought, and written a lot about how tech and data actually matters for governments and development organizations, and how it doesn't. He's also worked with DG's clients to manage development assistant portfolios, open up development data, and visualize performance information. Dustin's current day job is leading partnerships, communications, and new business for DG. His background, however, is in tech, monitoring and evaluation, especially impact evaluations, and transparency. He also co-founded and worked with a community development NGO in Haiti. I spoke with Dustin in Washington, D.C. Hello, Dustin. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. Pleasure to be here.
You work for an organization called Development Gateway. You lead their Results Data Initiative. Why don't we start out by tell us, what is Development Gateway? Who are you? What do you do? What's your purpose?
Development Gateway is a nonprofit organization. We actually started as part of the World Bank a long time ago at the end of the 90s as like a tech innovation lab inside the bank. But pretty quickly afterward, 15 years ago, it became an independent nonprofit organization focused on promoting the role of data and technology in international development. So we work globally in over 30 countries with government agencies, with development agencies, with implementers, INGOs, others, to create useful technology, think about how to use data to inform the development process, open up information, make it accessible, try and interact better with citizens, with other development actors, basically just improve the way that we do development by using technology well. So we like to think that we were one of the very first ICT for D organizations and remain, hopefully, a leading thinker and implementer in the ICT for D movement.
So give us some specific examples of what you're doing right now, about what are you doing that's innovative, what are you doing that's bending, that's stretching, that's, people are going, whoa, we didn't think of that before.
Yeah, I think we're doing a lot of stuff right now. And frankly, a lot of it is developing data management systems. For example, we just finished a big information management system for the entire UN system to use to report on key performance metrics. We just built a series of dashboards with the government of Tanzania. They're intended to open up and visualize, share information about performance in some of their key development sectors, and especially to make it more useful for government officials at the local level. So, that's some of our, I think, really cool but pretty straightforward technology development stuff. But I think where we're really pushing the envelope right now is in thinking hard about the real tangible role of data in development. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of rhetoric about this right now, right? Here we are in early.
We're in the age of big data. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the age of big data. It's the data revolution. We have so humbly coined it, right? Here we are in the wake of the sustainable development.
Nobody used data for anything before this, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We just invented numbers in 2015, and here we are using them. No, there's this whole movement, and a lot of people that talk about it, and all these panels, and all of these events and forums and convenings and all these things. But at the end of the day, what we have been learning about is what it takes for somebody at the local level, somebody really locally, to use information to inform a development decision. What are their constraints? What are their needs? What information do they have? What information do they still need? And what can we do as a development community to really support these really critically important actors in using data to further their development objectives? So basically getting out of sort of the macro level excitement sphere and thinking in some detail about what it takes to make data matter locally. And that's what a lot of my work is focused on most recently.
And do you have a concrete example of maybe either how you piloted something or how something's being rolled out?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think the first is that we've been doing a lot of applied learning, a lot of thinking to really try and bring some light to this issue. So about a year ago, we got approached by the Gates Foundation to do some thinking about results or about M&E data specifically. So try and understand better how people are using this information, how it's collected, what they do with it, which decisions it informs, and what we as a community can do better or do differently to make sure that all of these results management efforts that we fund and pursue really have some of their intended impacts. And so this has been a fascinating piece of work. And over the course of the last year, we've talked to, I think now over 400 people, mostly at the local level in 3 countries, local government officials, implementing organizations, people working in the donor community, to talk to them about what data they collect and what they do with it and how they report it and how they use it to inform decisions, and have really gleaned a lot of insights about the nature of results data. And so, and I should mention we're focusing specifically on the health and agriculture sectors just to bound some of these discussions. And in the process have been able to learn a great deal both about what's good, the times when people at the local level are really trying very hard to use this performance information to improve the work that they do, but also what's bad. And I'm going to have lots of examples, but to give you a couple of compelling concrete examples. I spoke a few months ago with an agricultural extension worker, a really brave woman working in rural Ghana, who, of course, as an extension worker, had a responsibility for a group of farmers in a certain area, and was required, of course, to collect a great deal of data. In fact, spent a lot of her time collecting a lot of information to report to the central government, ultimately to inform donor reports with some of the key metrics that they were collecting about farmer performance in that area. But at the same time, and we had this really fascinating conversation where she explained that at the same time, the information that she felt that she needed, the performance metrics that she felt that she needed in order to really manage well these farmers and help them improve their production, she couldn't get from this big long-form report that she had to create for the Ministry of Agriculture and for the donor community. And so she was keeping her own, basically, performance scorecard on paper, handwritten, in parallel to, in addition to all the effort she was doing to actually fill out this formal report. She was keeping her own metrics that she was using to do a better job of managing the performance of these farmers that she was responsible for. And I just found that to be such a compelling point about both the burden sometimes that we place as a development community, especially on local people when it comes to data collection, but also about the opportunities for really empowering somebody at a local level to think hard about what information they need to improve the work that they're doing, and how that really is the focus, the data focus that is probably poised to have the most dramatic impacts on how development really happens. So that's just a flavor of some of the lessons that we've been learning from this research initiative, but have a lot more of these collective insights coming out in the coming months.
In that particular case in Ghana, did she feel that the work that she was doing on the long form for the government, was it being used? Did she feel it was useful, or was like, I have to do this because it's part of my job, but really, I know that I'm going to be effective if I use this other data?
Honestly, if you look at hers and everybody else's responses, it's a lot more of the latter. I mean, one of the really important trends that we've drawn out of this is that most of the people who are primarily responsible for producing most of the data that we trumpet about in the development community don't really have a sense about what it's for. I mean, they don't have a clear demand case for it at the local level, and they don't typically receive any feedback about it, and they really don't have like a strong internal mandate or drive to do that because the purpose really hasn't been made clear. And I don't want to overgeneralize and say that data only matters or it's only worth collecting if it's useful for the person who collects it. That's obviously an overgeneralization. Mm-hmm. There are lots of needs for advocacy, for accountability, for high-level policymaking. But I have a very strong feeling from this work that we've been doing that we as a community don't think enough about who's using the indicator we collect for what, and especially don't think enough about the cost versus the benefit of collecting that information from people who have really important work to do at the local level. And I think that those are some of the really important trends that we've been able to uncover with a lot of qualitative evidence in these countries.
Is there another initiative the Development Gateway is working on outside this particular research that you think is compelling or cutting edge?
I'd like to think that
Like
a lot of
all
the
of it
things
is, of course. Everything we do is cutting edge.
are compelling and cutting edge. Some of the really interesting, this is, I think, a really important piece and is really helping us characterize some of our thinking about data use in other sectors as well. So we're in the midst of some other applied research, for example, looking at data use more broadly amongst ministries of like finance and planning. So people who use higher level finance and performance data about development progress. We've been doing the same type of qualitative work to understand what type of information is most useful for these people. And that stems from the work that we've been doing for many years now in helping governments set up aid information management tools. So we were one of the pioneers after the Paris Declaration in 2005 at developing tools that help some of these ministries of finance and planning, the people who are responsible for coordinating the entire set of development activities in a particular country. I've been trying to give them the software tools and the training and some of the advice that they need to be able to do a good job of keeping track of, first, all of the development information about all of the different donor activities that are happening in their country, but also trying to empower them with the tools and the skills and the perspectives to be able to use that information meaningfully. So to give you an example, I spent quite a bit of time working with Nepal's Ministry of Finance on this process, a really excellent group of friends and colleagues that I think really owned this process to a large degree. And over the course of a few years, were some of the leaders in opening up and publicizing all of the donor information that they had and really trying hard to engage with the donor community and say, listen, this is the information we have about what you're doing. And this is what we'd like you to do. And eventually used all of that data to inform a fairly controversial development assistance policy, which they issued just before the tragic earthquake happened last year. But in this policy, they essentially articulated some fairly firm parameters for how they wanted development assistance to be allocated based off of the data and evidence that they had collected in part through the systems that we had set up for them. And so it was this, essentially they were giving specific directions to the donor community on which sectors they wanted them to focus on how they wanted them to reduce fragmentation by increasing their pooled funding, and basically gave these considerations and really led the process using data of how development ought to be allocated in the country. And so these are some of the, that's I think one of my favorite examples from recent memory, but those are some of the efforts that we're doing to really try and help some of these long-term partners that we have think more about how they can use the development information they've been collecting to really inform planning policy and so on.
You've been thinking and working and writing about how we're using data in development for many years now. What's the biggest disruption you've seen in this area in the last 2 or 3 years? Is there something that's just been like, whoa, okay, this is a real game changer? Or has it just been real incremental since you started with Development Gateway?
Yeah, I think the biggest game changer is that rhetoric that I referred to slightly mockingly at the beginning of our conversation. I mean, I think that is disruptive in the fact that over the course of the last few years, the fact that open, accessible information has become more and more seen as a status quo in the development community, I think, is the beginning of a fairly disruptive game changer. So, I think that the rhetoric is not enough, but I think that we've basically seen our field accept the fact that information matters a lot, that we need to invest more in it, that we need to invest more in people's ability to use it, and that we need to put real resources and thinking and action behind the value of data and information. So when we talk about things like the new Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data and other initiatives, again, this is mostly still about rhetoric, about discussion, about ideas, but I think we're starting to see some vehicles come together that are going to invest more money in statistical capacity development and improved approaches to monitoring and evaluation. And hopefully, and what we hope to be able to influence, is also in building the skills and the tools and the space necessary for development actors to really be able to use information to inform the work that they do in much more meaningful ways. And so I think that is, I think we're in the midst of an important trend, and it's just that we're sort of at the beginning of figuring out what it looks like in practice. And I hope that that's our contribution to the movement.
And do you think, if I go to Ghana, if I go to Nepal, if I go to Haiti, if I go to Brazil tomorrow, the rhetoric is not only as vibrant, but it's also, the geeks are winning, basically?
No, I don't think so. Not yet. That's the right question. And I think that the rhetoric is really vibrant at the international level. I think it sounds great in New York, but I think that the geeks aren't winning at the local level. And if I could characterize it, I've been thinking a lot about how this fits into sort of a 5-step process when we think about development data. And the first thing that you need is good data. And we all know that that's not the case.
That's tough. The good data that's like the hardest step.
Right. And so but assuming, pretend that that all of a sudden we wave our wand and we have great data. All of a sudden everybody really has high quality data that's got, all the local representativeness that it needs. And say that we have the right data. Well, the second step is that we have to have the right tools and skills to use it, right? So somebody working in a local district agriculture office, or somebody working in a ministry, or somebody working for an implementing NGO needs to actually know how to use that information, needs to know what tools are available to help them deal with it, needs to know the right ways to present it in a compelling way. And so that's another, that's a really important focus area. So right now as a field, steps 1 and 2 are really most of what we focus on. But then step 3, especially from a government perspective, but also from an agency perspective, step 3 is that somebody really needs to have the space, the permission to do something with it. You need to have your boss tell you, yeah, it's okay to use X information for Y purpose to really influence the decisions that we're making. And then the next step, and this is a really important takeaway from this results data initiative, is that step 4 is you need to actually have some resources that you can do something with. I mean, we talk to people about data at a local level, and they say, yeah, this is a great conversation, and I'd love to be able to make more evidence-based decisions, but I don't have enough money to buy pencils. And that's not a new development problem, but I think oftentimes as a data-focused element of the development community, we don't often consider that all of this evidence-based decision-making has to actually have some resources to allocate, or it doesn't matter. And then finally, step 5 is somebody has to care. There has to be some recognition, some acknowledgement, some endorsement, some broader incentive for people to really incorporate more data evidence.
Is there maybe a 6th step there as well? Not to completely step in, and into research here, but it's the feedback loop, right? Exactly. One of the things that we've seen is that if the person at the local level, or the person, your agriculture extension woman that we talked about earlier, if she doesn't see that the data is going up the food chain, being used, and then actually having effect for her locally, what's the point, right? Exactly. It's closing that loop to come back and say, oh yeah, wow, that when I put all this hard work in, even if maybe it's just these little tiny incremental changes, I can actually see that, or I'm able to communicate that to the community that I'm serving.
That's absolutely right. In fact, I think you've just turned the process into a cycle, and I'm gonna poach that back if that's all right for the next time we talk about it.
Wow, look at that! I think that's the first time we've had I think it's the first time this show has actually had a actual intellectual contribution to somebody's work. Fantastic.
There we go. I'll cite you in the blog post when we put it out. So that's great.
Awesome. So going forward, you're paid to think about this stuff and think about the future. What's the next 5 years look like for either the results initiative that you're working on right now, or for Development Gateway? Is there something coming down the pipe that you're really excited about? Is it more of the same? Is this conversation just getting more vibrant?
Yeah, I think, I hope it's more kind of the same, but I hope that it's more specifically focused on the things that we want to do to really build people's ability to use data in meaningful ways. So what I hope happens in the next few years, I hope that basically we have been trying to get funding, get investment, get support for more initiatives that focus specifically on step 2 of that cycle we were talking about, building the skills of people to use information. So we've encountered a lot of people in our work, especially with local governments, local organizations, who are ambitious and talented and brilliant and just could use a little bit of help to be able to know how to use data well, to really think about the role of data and technology in their work. I mean, there have just been too many initiatives in the past that, drop a tech platform on a government agency, or, open up a bunch of data with no real clear idea of who's using it for what. And so really getting down into the weeds and providing the training, providing the support, providing some of the really specially designed tools that can help people, especially at a local level, to use this kind of data more meaningfully for making decisions about where budget goes, how staff time is spent, what policy decisions are made. That's what we see is the really important need in the next 5 years, taking it from discussion into practice more and more. And we've already started working on that, but we're hoping to get the funding and the support to be able to continue to build out these initiatives for supporting especially policymakers and implementers at the local level. And there are several, nascent efforts from different groups. I mean, a lot of people are thinking about this, but I don't think that it's been mainstreamed enough yet that it gets fully operationalized into development programming, into serious funding for local governments and implementers and others. So that's one of the things that we really want to see and really want to be part of in the next few years. And that has implications, across everything. I mean, another thing that we're working on that's coming down the pike is trying to think about what tools are going to be most useful for the governments and other stakeholders that are going to be engaged in SDG reporting. I mean, there's going to be huge investments in all of the data that's needed to report on these several hundred indicators that now inform the SDGs. But what's that information going to be used for? And what tools, what skills, what processes can we put in place to help people make sure that they're really benefiting from the SDG tracking process, that it's not an extractive process, but instead is something that can really help the local governments and CSOs and others who are part of this process to really get beneficial information and use it to measurably improve performance at each step of the policy cycle. And then, in addition to that, I mean, so that's really where we hope a lot of the thinking goes. And then in addition to that, we're quite engaged in the broader transparency community initiatives around like open contracting, open procurement information, open aid, open extractives. We've just started doing some work helping to build tech and tools for opening up extractives information. So there's a lot of work, a lot of discussion, a lot of effort in the last few years in the development community around transparency, the role of transparency and reducing corruption, improving efficiency, helping us realize better development outcomes across the board. And we're really keen to also help operationalize that transparency movement, where again, it's been a great rhetorical movement. There's been a lot of effort, a lot of thinking, but really getting to the brass tacks, shall we say, of how people, especially again local governments and implementers, use some of this new open data to improve advocacy, to think about policy, to improve operations, and so on. That's some of what we want out of the next few years.
Nice. While you've been talking, a theme kept sort of reoccurring in my brain about the narrative. You've mentioned it a couple of different times as well. Have you seen a danger in he who controls the data or they who control the data then control the narrative for not only what the data means, but then what happens in the setting, in the country, in the context, and how that ultimately feeds into policy and ideology and those kinds of things? I mean, that's a pretty broad question, but do you know where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I totally know. Well, I think I know where you're going with it. Let me take it where I think should go. I mean, that's a brilliant question. And what's so, I mean, there's a bit of irony in this idea that, yeah, we have this real open data movement in the development field that is intended ultimately to try and even out power structures, right? I mean, it's intended to...
Right, and it's assumed ultimately at the end of the day that we would all obviously arrive at the same answers when we look at this open data.
Exactly. But what for me is sort of a recent revelation that's actually come from some collaboration with some good friends in the peace building community. You may have heard of Safer World, a UK NGO, good friends that do some really important work in peace building. And in working with a friend there has really helped me uncover this really important point that even when there are lots of local organizations, government or otherwise, that have really sort of signed on to this data revolution and are seriously looking at ways to use data and tech to improve development, that these people are still elites. And that's not a bad thing, but that really as a development community, we haven't thought very much yet about, I shouldn't say that, there are people who are thinking about this, but I'm not sure we've collectively acknowledged enough some of the risks associated with the data revolution, as it were, really not reaching the needs of the most marginalized communities. So the bottom line is that the most marginalized people still don't have access to data and technology. Empowering data revolution is not empowering them, it's empowering the people that already know how to use data and tech well. And that's not, again, I'm not making a value judgment, but instead just saying how this has really helped me to reflect on what we're doing and how we think beyond the next application or think beyond some data platform to how is this information, affecting society much more broadly, and what can we do, even as a tech-focused organization, what should we be doing in the non-tech space to make sure that we're really helping information beyond just data, but information in whatever format really be beneficial for the people who aren't part of the data and technology mainstream. And I think that's something that we really risk overlooking often as a community that we really need to think about more. Mm.
Exactly.
Did I answer your question?
No, eloquently. Absolutely. During this time that we're speaking right now, we're currently witnessing, you've probably seen this on the airways right now, it's the Panama Papers, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And the Panama Papers, for whoever has downloaded this and listening to it right now, is 11 million leaked documents from a Panamanian law firm that supposedly contain lots and lots of information about money flows on offshore accounts and whatnot. And there's lots of speculation about, does this show corruption? Does this show, basically bad things that people who are wealthy elites, using these offshore accounts to move billions and billions and trillions of dollars around the world. And as I've watched this unfold in our media, and I'm thinking and reflecting on what you're talking about as well, open data for governments, et cetera, it's really, right now, media outlets and the ICIJ, I can't remember the organization that is actually moving that Panama paper thing forward right off the top of my head, but they're controlling the narrative about what it means. And so now everyone who's named in their report has to then try to defend another position in the narrative or agree with it, right?
Right,
and
exactly.
A first mover in a narrative is usually an incredibly powerful position, especially when you think of places like North Korea or Haiti or other places like South Sudan, where disseminating information is difficult at best. When you get one shot at it, the person who gets to do that usually has a considerable amount of power over the actions that will happen for quite some time to come.
That's really an excellent point and well articulated. And, there's this concept, this theme that we've been chewing on a little bit of the political economy of data, right? Really thinking about the politics behind data. And frankly, I think often the more tech-minded people like me or the organizations in the community to think about these things from a technical perspective, thinking about the data, thinking about the technology, thinking about the nuts and bolts of how this works. I think that we would do well to reflect more often on these much broader political and political economy questions that we've been discussing, right? Because that's so important, and it doesn't mean that we can solve every issue from the outset. But you make such a powerful point about who controls the narrative has a great deal of power, and we don't want to inadvertently empower, people that maybe ought not be empowered. And again, that's a fraught conversation and one that lots of others have had. But I do think that there's often some naivete in the way that the technical-minded part of the community, the ICT for D part of our community, says all data is good, tech is great, openness is the fundamental principle, maybe without thinking about some of the implications. So,
sure, and
it's a great point.
To tie that in a bow as well, it's interesting that what we're talking about right now, it's we're sort of concentrating on the dark side of that. But if you were to flip the coin on that, how many times in either recent history or not, where either access to data or open data or controlling that narrative has led to positive results, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But let's leave that there for now. Development Gateway's been around for a while. You said that earlier in the show.
Yeah.
What happens if you either, you're like, oh my God, I just had this brilliant idea about how we could better use the data, or somebody else in the organization or somebody from the outside says, Development Gateway, have you considered this and this new thing? How would innovation happen inside Development Gateway? Do you guys have a forum for that? Are people able to spitball? And is there like a little fund that you could use to pilot ideas? Or what happens internally to keep you fresh and keep you cutting edge?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because that's been something that we have really, to the extent that one can operationalize innovation, I think that we've really tried to do that. I have a colleague, wish he could join us. Maybe keep him in mind for a future podcast.
Okay,
Josh
sure.
Powell, our Director of Innovation. And that's his role, basically, is to really help us catalyze innovation within the organization. And we do that in a couple of different ways. One, and the biggest way that we do it, is that because we're an NGO, we can pursue grant money. And so we can come up with, some of our ideas and say, this is, we talk to the rest of the community, we engage and say, okay, this is what we really think is the way to go. And then we can approach funders with it. And that's where we've gotten some of our most beneficial kind of funding to do some of the bigger innovation activities like this results data initiative. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two, internally, is I think we have a culture that we've tried to develop in different ways that really celebrates new ideas, innovation, pretty flat structure. Lots of people can come up with ideas. We actually sponsored an internal innovation challenge several months ago, where different staff members, and we're about half software developers and half operational implementation people. And so we had this innovation challenge, which was fascinating internally, where basically people came up with their ideas that they wanted to pitch, and absolutely anybody in the organization could pitch an idea. It was totally an open floor. And we pitched ideas to the entire group. The entire organization voted, and we picked 3 of these promising ideas. One focused on humanitarian innovation, the other more of like an internal tech process innovation. The third, more focused on the open contracting, open procurement stuff that we invested a little bit of seed money in, basically let them create project teams, start working on some initial prototypes. That's one way we've been pushing it. And then often things come up that we just think this is a good idea, and we keep basically an innovation fund. I mean, we're not a big organization, but we're able to, we've been doing okay, and we're able to keep a little bit of an innovation fund set aside when we have a big idea. So like the SDG prototypes that I've been, the way we've been thinking about tools and processes for tracking and using SDG data, we're funding that currently out of our own small innovation budget until we're able to find a bigger partner that wants to work with us on it. We actually have a really cool idea that a good friend and colleague of mine that I think Mark, in Kenya, is working on, that's going to be focused on automating the way that tax payments are made from small and medium industries based on his fascinating experience with the tax administration in Kenya. So, I mean, these are just some of the ideas that we're able to pick up with. And if we decide as a leadership team that it's an idea worth investing in, we put some money behind it. And then the last thing I'll mention is we find that being part of a community is really crucial to innovation. So we're part of the Open Gov Hub, which is actually a collaborative workspace with organizations working in open government, transparency, data, et cetera. And so we have lots of events and, basically just talking to people in the hallway about different ideas in real time from lots of different organizations is really beneficial. Another group called Feedback Labs, which is, another coalition of organizations thinking about those points about citizen feedback that you were just discussing. So those are some other vehicles that really help us keep some of our thinking fresh and make sure that we interact with the right people to push us in meaningful directions.
I do love the small world of the development community. Of course, I've done work with Mark, and he's brilliant. I love him. Is there one of these initiatives you've been talking about right now, or one you can think of, maybe the data initiative you're working on right now, that came out of your innovation fund, or it was an idea of somebody that was sparked in a hallway that's now, hey, this is just standard how we do business now. Like, this is just either a standard product or service, or it's something that you've implemented as a process internally?
Yeah, actually, this results data initiative stemmed from conversations we had some years ago about how to take the aid management platform, this whole aid information management approach, and really focus it more on results-based management. And so that was some years ago. Me and kind of the senior researcher working with me on this study went to Ethiopia and helped the government kind of think through its processes at the central level for managing results information. And so, it was something we talked about and thought about and didn't get to do much about. And eventually, a good friend at the Gates Foundation who had been part of a lot of these discussions and thinking about the same things approached us and said, okay, let's really learn something meaningful about this. And so we've been able to really scale up our thinking and learn a ton, and are now in the process of thinking about what's next, right? And thinking about both how we can institutionalize some of what we've learned into service offerings around both tech and then like training and services to help improve results-based management, especially at the local level, but also has basically served as a launch pad to some new ideas around what we do next. And those are still under wraps, though I'll look forward to sharing them hopefully soon. But, really trying to also explore what the new intellectual directions are when thinking about results data and how we use it and how we improve it as a development community.
Everybody's got to have some things that are under wraps, man.
Yeah. So stay tuned. But no, so that's just one example. A lot of, and honestly, a lot of this open contracting, open procurement work stemmed from some initial innovation activities that we got a little bit of money from the World Bank to do a few years ago. And we're able to really have a great experience working with the government to think through the process of opening up its procurement data. And that's since launched a little bit more of a formal line of services that we're now pursuing in several places. So I think we're always, like everybody, learning about how you turn innovation into operation, but we've got some real examples of where it's happened, and we look forward to more.
Just a couple more questions for you. The first one is, what's the thing you wake up in the morning, you go to the office, or you're working from your home office, or whatever, that you're just like, I just wish this would just get done? Is there a hurdle or an obstacle or a fundamental issue that you've seen it out there and you'd love to be able to tackle it, but it sort of just keeps getting in your way?
Well, yeah, probably a lot, right? Like one of the short-term ones that feels a little bit vexing to me is I've been trying for a long time to get a little bit of like funding and support to try and do some serious data capacity building, like really like I had mentioned before, really work with local governments, local implementers to really think, like go through a long process of thinking about how they use data to inform policy and do it in a way that's different from, maybe your traditional kind of results-based management training. But we have a lot of ideas here, and it's really been a tough hurdle to get somebody to like totally see how that by itself is an activity worth pursuing. I mean, it makes sense in context of other things, and people often tack on all kinds of training, of course, to different development activities. But there's this real like very specific activity of data capacity building that I really see as like a glaring need in so many elements of public administration and development implementers in the global south that we're not addressing head on. We're kind of skirting around it, not really investing the resources we need to build those skills, and thinking about how we can leverage all of the amazing e-learning and other types of tools and approaches that are available to really tackle that issue. So that's a big one that I think about a lot in this context.
Sounds a lot like, I characterize it as it's the culture of digital, right? I mean, you live in it, I live in it. We don't even think about it. I mean, anybody who's done cross-cultural, training or anything like that, digital culture is its own thing, and we wake up expecting and knowing how to interact, and we rely upon our devices and the big pipe of the internet to bring us things, and that's still not the expectation for the vast majority of people around the world. At least that's what I've found.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And, when your reality is a computer that doesn't work and an internet connection that's not really on and, not a lifetime of exposure to Excel, it becomes really, there's a lot of big barriers to really interacting with evidence, information, data in useful ways. And, we can do stuff about that, but we don't really acknowledge it head on. So.
Yeah. Last couple of questions are really just sort of help you help the rest of the community to geek out and maybe learn about who to pay attention to. Who's on your radar? Is there a blog you read, organizations you're paying attention to, particular personalities you think are super cutting edge and innovative that you think others should be turned on to?
Yeah, probably a lot of listeners follow Duncan Green from Oxfam, from Poverty to Power, but I love reading his stuff. He'll touch sometimes on data issues, but doesn't write necessarily about the data and technology issues, but some of the fundamental issues. Had a really great conversation with him about this results data research and these other issues, and I just really value the stuff that he writes about. I really appreciate the Doing Development Differently movement and the various people that have been really kind of writing and thinking about that, because, even though it's not necessarily about data and technology, that's why I find it valuable, because it's talking about principles, it's talking about empowerment, it's talking about how we approach these things, and that really helps me think about where data and tech really fit into the equation, and sometimes where they don't. And, there's been some all this stuff about problem-driven, iterative adaptation, and similar things that have come out of those conversations I found to be really valuable and useful. There are a lot of players in kind of this ICT for D space that a lot of folks are really familiar with, and I definitely follow, kind of the blogs and the discussion. I really like a lot of the stuff that Results for Development has been working on, and like to follow some of their stuff pretty closely. And then from my perspective, I've also been thinking a lot about and following fairly closely the impact investing community, which I find to be, fascinating for a lot of different reasons, but because I see the potential for a lot of the lessons we have learned in the development community around data, around evidence, around information to do a lot more to inform the private sector. And I think that there are huge development benefits from that. I have a good friend who is part of a new initiative called Copernicus, which is essentially aiming to connect a lot of the different disparate data sources you can find about Africa, and basically, combining them into some really useful, really powerful, value-added data that they're providing to investors, basically taking all of this development information and giving it a real valuable private sector focus. And I think that things like that have really important implications for the future of how development happens. And so that's a lot of the stuff that I follow pretty closely.
Those are all great names. We're going to make sure to write them all down and put them up on the blog post as well. Last question for you. Is there a particular innovation, either inside or outside of the sphere that you look at every day of data, that you're most excited about? Is there a cool tool, a technique, a process, just someone that just really hits something out of the park that you think everybody else should know about it?
There are a lot of really cool things. I mean, when we talk about movements, and I mentioned impact investing, that's a really popular buzzword, but I see, if done right, big implications there that bear thinking about in a lot of ways. I would say, that there are a lot of so we view I view a lot of development technology things with a grain of salt. And I think that's good. And I think that, all of us should be a little bit pragmatic when we look at technology and the role of technology in development. But I was just having a conversation the other day with a group called Premise Data that have a really fascinating, it's a Silicon Valley firm that has a really fascinating methodology for basically using local reporters, paying local reporters to use their mobile phones to report data on any number of things, from consumer prices to weather conditions to, political information and so on. And it basically built this huge global network of data providers, and it put together some really cool tools and platforms for using that information. And they're starting to get a fair amount of traction. But I really found their approach really compelling in that, they're paying people locally to provide a lot of the data that's hard to get otherwise, and thinking about innovative ways to use it, and really trying to trying hard to plug into the broader development community. And that's one thing that, that just crossed my radar really recently, that I think definitely bears checking out. Initiatives like that are definitely worth following. So.
Dustin, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Great time talking with you. Really appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.